Sometimes a man's worth isn't written in his clothes or the steadiness of his hands. Sometimes it's hidden beneath years of hard living, waiting for someone wise enough to see past the surface. Emmett Cole stood at Josephine LaRue's door, hat in trembling hands, knowing this was his last chance. The widow owned the finest ranch in 3 counties and had no use for drifters. But when he whispered those desperate words about being worth more than he looked, something in her weathered heart stirred. She gave him 1 week to prove himself. What would happen when she discovered the secrets this broken cowboy carried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Double J Ranch as Josephine LaRue watched the stranger from her kitchen window. His weathered hat sat crooked on graying hair, and his boots had seen more miles than most men saw in a lifetime. Everything about Emmett Cole spoke of a hard life lived on the margins, yet something in his bearing the way he held his shoulders straight, despite the weight of years made her pause before dismissing him outright. She touched the gold chain at her throat, feeling Thomas's wedding ring beneath her cotton blouse. 3 years had passed since consumption took her husband. 3 years of running this ranch with nothing but her own stubborn will and the memory of his gentle laugh echoing through empty rooms. The townspeople of Cedar Flats had expected her to sell, to retreat to some boarding house in the city, like a proper widow should. Instead, she'd doubled the herd size and turned the Double J into the most profitable spread in the county. The kitchen still smelled of the coffee she'd brewed at dawn, strong enough to wake the dead, as Thomas used to say. Through the window, she watched Emmett leading his tired horse toward the barn. The animal was as worn as its master, ribs showing beneath a dull coat, but it moved with the trust of a creature well cared for, despite poverty. A man who tended his horse properly might be worth considering, even if his pockets were empty. Her housekeeper, Maria Santos, bustled in from the pantry with flour dusting her apron. "That man, he looks hungry," she observed in her soft accent, setting down a basket of eggs. "When did he last eat a proper meal, you think?" "Hunger's not my concern," Josephine replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "I need a worker, not a charity case." Maria's knowing smile said everything her words didn't. At 62, the older woman had raised 8 children of her own and recognized the signs of a heart wrestling with its better nature. "Sometimes the hungry ones work hardest, Senora. They have the most to prove." Through the window, they watched Emmett emerge from the barn and survey the ranch with careful eyes. He moved with purpose, despite his obvious exhaustion, noting the sagging fence posts, the worn hinges on the corral gate, the places where a ranch showed its age. Most drifters would have headed straight for the bunkhouse and a place to rest. This one was already planning improvements. The Double J stretched across 1,200 acres of prime grazing land, bordered by Willow Creek to the east and rolling hills that turned purple at sunset. Thomas had built it from nothing, arriving in Texas with $200 and a dream bigger than his bank account. Now cattle dotted the pastures like scattered brown stones, and the main house stood solid and proud against the endless sky. It was a legacy worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the loneliness that came with being a woman alone in a man's world. Josephine had learned to read men the way Thomas read, whether by the signs they couldn't hide. The way they looked at her cattle told her if they knew beef from dairy. The way they handled tools revealed whether they'd worked with their hands or merely talked about it. And the way they met, her eyes showed whether they respected her authority or merely tolerated it until they could find a way around it. Emmett Cole looked at her ranch the way Thomas once had, with appreciation for what had been built and vision for what could be improved. When he'd spoken at her door, his voice carried the rough courtesy of a man raised to tip his hat to ladies, even when asking for work. Most importantly, he'd asked for a chance to prove himself rather than assuming he deserved one. The morning air carried the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the creak of the windmill that drew water from the well Thomas had dug their second year here. These were the sounds of prosperity, of a working ranch that had weathered drought and flood, disease and market crashes. But prosperity meant nothing if she couldn't find reliable help to maintain it. Her last foreman, Buck Morrison, had quit 2 months ago after trying to convince the other hands that a woman had no business running cattle. The confrontation had been swift and decisive. Josephine could outshoot and outthink most men in the county, and she'd proven both points that day. But finding good help had grown increasingly difficult. Men either wanted to court her or control her, and she had no patience for either. From the bunkhouse came the voices of her remaining hands. Old Pete, who'd worked for Thomas since the beginning, young Tom, barely 18 but strong as an ox, and Luis, Maria's nephew, who had a gift with horses that bordered on magical. 3 good men, but not enough for a spread this size, especially with spring branding season approaching. The screen door creaked as Emmett approached the main house. Through the mesh, Josephine could see him more clearly now. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into sun and wind. The careful way he moved suggested old injuries that still ached on cold mornings. His clothes were clean but patched, his gear well maintained, despite its age. Here was a man who took pride in what little he had. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat as he had before. Up close, she could see silver threading through brown hair that might have been handsome once, before life carved its story in weathered skin and careful eyes. "I know you said a week, but I was hoping to start this morning. There's good light for working, and that fence line could use attention before your cattle decide to go visiting the neighbors." His observation was accurate. The north pasture fence had been on her list of repairs for weeks. That he'd noticed it during his brief survey spoke well of his experience. "You've worked cattle before," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Been working ranches since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Know my way around horses, cattle, and whatever needs fixing." He paused, then added with quiet honesty, "Haven't had steady work in some time, I'll grant you, but my hands remember what they learned." Josephine studied his face, looking for the telltale signs of a man who drank his wages or gambled them away. Instead, she saw the hollow look of genuine hunger and the carefully maintained dignity of someone who'd fallen on hard times through no fault of his own. The war had created many such men-soldiers who'd returned to find their homes gone, their families scattered, their places in the world uncertain. "Room and board plus $30 a month," she said finally. "You'll bunk with the other hands, eat what Maria cooks, and work sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Sunday's your own time, long as you're back by Monday morning ready to work. Any drinking, fighting, or shirking, and you're gone that same day. Do we understand each other?" The relief that flickered across his features was quickly hidden, but not before she caught it. "Yes, ma'am, you'll have no trouble from me, I promise you that." "Promises are easy to make and hard to keep," she replied, but her tone had softened slightly. Actions matter more than words on a working ranch. "You'll start with old Pete this morning. He knows every inch of this place and every job that needs doing. Prove yourself to him, and you'll have proven yourself to me." As Emmett headed toward the barn where Pete was already preparing for the day's work, Josephine remained at the window. Something about the way he walked, purposeful but not hurried, respectful but not servile, reminded her of Thomas in his younger days. Both men carried themselves with quiet dignity despite their circumstances, and both understood that honest work was its own reward. Maria appeared at her shoulder, following her gaze. "He has good hands," she observed, "and sad eyes. A man with sad eyes either makes trouble or makes good, no in between." "Which do you think he'll be?" Josephine asked. "That depends on whether someone gives him reason to hope again," Maria replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand its patterns. "Hopeless men are dangerous. Hopeful ones will move mountains." The day stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm of chores and decisions. But for the first time in months, Josephine felt a stirring of something she'd almost forgotten. Not hope. Exactly, that was too strong a word for such a small thing as hiring another hand. but curiosity, perhaps, about what lay beneath the surface of this weathered cowboy who spoke with such desperate conviction about his worth. From the corral came the sound of old Pete's voice raised in instruction, and Emmett's deeper tones responding with questions that showed he was listening, learning, adapting to the particular ways of the Double J. It was a sound that had been missing too long, the voice of a man who belonged somewhere, even if he didn't know it yet. Josephine touched Thomas's ring through her blouse once more, then turned away from the window to face the day's work. She had accounts to balance, supplies to order, and 100 decisions to make before sunset. But in the back of her mind, she found herself wondering about the secrets that lived behind Emmett Cole's careful eyes, and whether the week she'd given him would be enough time for the truth to reveal itself. The leather-bound ledger lay open on Thomas's old desk, its pages filled with numbers that told a story Josephine had been trying to ignore. 3 columns of figures stared back at her in the lamplight: income, expenses, and the growing gap between them that threatened everything she'd worked to preserve. The banknote Thomas had signed 2 years before his death was coming due, and the payment would take nearly everything the ranch had earned this season. She traced a finger down the columns, hoping the mathematics would somehow change if she looked at them differently. 1,500 head of cattle, prime grazing land, and a reputation for quality beef that stretched to Kansas City and paper, the Double J was worth a fortune. In reality, drought the previous summer and a harsh winter had taken their toll. Feed costs had doubled, several prize bulls had been lost to wolves, and now the bank was calling in its marker. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Come," she called, closing the ledger quickly. Emmett stood in the doorway, hat in hand as always. 4 days had passed since she'd given him the job, and he'd thrown himself into the work with a determination that impressed even old Pete. The sagging fence had been repaired, the barn roof patched, and the stubborn gate that had stuck for months now swung smooth as silk. "Begging your pardon, Ma'am, but I thought you should know we're missing cattle from the south pasture. I count at least 30 head, maybe more." Josephine's blood chilled. Missing cattle could mean strays, but more likely it meant rustlers. With the bank payment looming, she couldn't afford to lose a single animal. "You're certain?" "Yes, Ma'am. Found tracks leading toward the river, too many for strays wandering off on their own. Looks like they were driven, and recently." His weathered face was grim. "I can follow the trail if you want, but it'll mean going into rough country." The south pasture held some of her best breeding stock, cattle worth twice what ordinary beef brought at market. Losing them would mean more than financial hardship. It would mean the end of everything Thomas had built. "Take Pete and Tom with you," she said, rising from the desk. "Ma'am, with respect, this kind of tracking is better done alone. Too many riders make noise, and if there's trouble—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I've had experience with this sort of thing before." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. The careful way he held himself, the quick assessment his eyes made of the room's exits, the unconscious positioning that kept his back to the wall. These weren't the habits of an ordinary ranch hand. "What kind of experience?" "The kind that kept me alive when other men didn't make it home from places where tracking meant the difference between living and dying." His voice carried the weight of memories he didn't care to share. "I can find your cattle, Mrs. LaRue, and I can do it quiet enough that whoever took them won't know I'm coming." The implications of his words settled in the room like smoke. Here was confirmation that Emmett Cole had secrets, that his past held more than the simple story of a drifter down on his luck. But right now, with her livelihood disappearing into the wilderness, his secrets mattered less than his skills. "How long?" she asked. "Depends on how far they've gone and whether they're still moving. Could be back by tomorrow night. Might be longer if the trail's cold." From somewhere in the house came the sound of Maria preparing supper, the comfortable domestic noise that had filled these rooms for years. Soon those sounds might belong to strangers if the bank foreclosed, if she couldn't find a way to meet the payment that hung over everything like a storm cloud waiting to break. "Go," she said finally, "but Emmett, be careful. Cattle can be replaced. You can't." Something flickered in his eyes at her words. Surprise, perhaps, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone worry about his return. "I'll be back." he said simply, then turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Through the night, Josephine found sleep elusive. Every sound made her wonder if it was Emmett returning with news, or rustlers coming back for more cattle, or simply the wind playing tricks with her nerves. The ledger's numbers haunted her dreams when she finally dozed, columns of figures marching like soldiers toward an inevitable defeat. Dawn brought no word, nor did the morning hours that stretched into afternoon. Old Pete went about his work with worried efficiency, while young Tom kept glancing toward the horizon as if he could will Emmett back through sheer determination. Even Maria's usual chatter was subdued, replaced by the kind of hushed activity that surrounds waiting for news that might change everything. It was nearly sunset when the sound of hoofbeats announced Emmett's return. He rode into the yard leading a string of 15 cattle, their brands clearly visible even in the fading light. Behind him, riding double on a tired horse, came 2 men. Josephine didn't recognize hands from neighboring ranches by the look of their gear. Found them in a box canyon about 20 miles south, Emmett reported as he dismounted. Rustlers had built a holding pen, planning to rebrand them before moving them to market. These fellows were in the same fix-lost cattle to the same gang. The 2 men introduced themselves as Jake Morrison from the Circle M and Frank Sullivan from the Bar S. Both had lost significant numbers to the organized theft ring that had been operating along the river for weeks. "Your man here found our cattle too," Morrison said, nodding toward Emmett with clear respect. "Tracked them like he was born to it, then got us all out without firing a shot." "What about the rustlers?" Josephine asked. Emmett's smile was thin and hard. "They decided it was healthier to relocate their operation to other parts. Won't be bothering anyone in this county again." The way he said it made Josephine wonder exactly what kind of conversation had taken place in that box canyon. But the important thing was that her cattle were home and the threat was ended. 15 head recovered wasn't the full 30 that had been taken, but it was enough to make the difference between surviving the bank payment and losing everything. As the neighboring ranchers prepared to drive their own recovered cattle home, Morrison pulled Josephine aside. "You've got yourself a good man there," he said, glancing toward Emmett. "Don't know where you found him, but hang on to him. Takes a special kind of skill to track like that and handle trouble without starting a war." After the visitors left, Josephine found Emmett tending his horse in the barn. The animal was worn from hard riding, but Emmett's care was thorough and gentle, the attention of a man who understood that his mount's welfare was tied to his own survival. 15 head, she said. "That's not everything, but it's enough." He looked up from brushing the horse's coat. "There's something else you should know. The men I spoke with. They mentioned other ranchers are facing the same troubles you are. Banknotes coming due, pressure to sell to a development company out of Austin. This rustling operation wasn't just about stealing cattle, it was about making sure ranchers couldn't meet their obligations." The implication hit her like a physical blow. Someone was orchestrating her troubles, using theft and financial pressure to force her off land that had been in the family for a generation. "Who's behind it?" "Don't know yet, but I mean to find out. These kinds of operations don't happen without money and planning behind them." His voice carried a promise that made her believe he'd keep digging until he found answers. Standing there in the golden light of the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and leather and honest work, Josephine felt something shift in her perception of the man before her. Emmett Cole might have arrived as a desperate drifter, but he was revealing himself to be something far more complexer, man with skills that went beyond ranch work, instincts honed by experiences she could only imagine, and a loyalty that had already proven itself worth more than gold. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their simplicity. His nod was equally simple, equally weighted with meaning. "Ma'am," he replied, but the formality couldn't hide the warmth in his eyes. For the first time since Thomas's death, Josephine didn't feel quite so alone in facing the challenges that lay ahead. The morning mist clung to Willow Creek as Emmett worked on the water trough, his movements precise and economical. 3 weeks had passed since the rustling incident, and his place on the Double J had shifted from temporary help to something that felt more permanent. The other hands had accepted him with the easy camaraderie of men who judged worth by actions rather than words, and even Josephine had begun to rely on his judgment in ways that surprised them both. Old Pete watched from the corral fence, whittling a piece of mesquite while he supervised. "You handle tools like a man who's built things that mattered," he observed, his weathered face creased with curiosity. Emmett paused in his work, considering how much to reveal. The truth was complicated, full of shadows and memories that didn't fit the simple story of a drifter looking for work. "Had occasion to build things that needed doing," he said finally, which was honest enough, without being complete. In his bedroll, carefully wrapped in oiled canvas, lay a cavalry saber that had seen action from Shiloh to Appomattox. The blade still held its edge despite the years, and sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, Emmett would hold it and remember what it felt like to be a man with purpose, with a cause worth fighting for. Captain Emmett Cole of the 5th Texas Cavalry had been a different man than the drifter who'd knocked on Josephine's door, but the skills remained even when the uniform was long gone. The war had ended 15 years ago, but its echoes still shaped the lives of men who'd survived it. Some, like Thomas LaRue, had channeled their military discipline into building something lasting. Others had found their way to bottle or grave, unable to bridge the gap between what they'd been and what peace required them to become. Emmett had fallen somewhere between, neither destroyed nor successfully rebuilt, carrying his past like a wound that wouldn't quite heal. "Emmett," young Tom's voice carried across the yard with urgency, "Mrs. LaRue wants to see you up at the house." The main house felt different now that Emmett had reason to enter it regularly. What had seemed imposing during his first desperate visit now revealed itself as a home built by people who understood both comfort and practicality. Thomas's presence lingered in every room. His books still lined the shelves. His favorite chair faced the window where he could watch his cattle graze. His rifle hung above the mantel like a promise that this place would be defended. Josephine waited in the parlor with a cup of coffee grown cold in her hands. The morning light streaming through lace curtains revealed new lines around her eyes, the strain of shouldering burdens meant to be shared. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression made him approach with care. "There's been talk in town," she said without preamble, "about us, about you working here, living here." She set down the cup and faced him squarely. "Some folks think it's improper for a widow to have a man like you so close to the house." The words hit him harder than they should have. He'd known this conversation would come. Eventually, a woman of Josephine's standing couldn't ignore the whispers forever, and his presence here complicated her reputation in ways that mattered in a place like Cedar Flats. "Would you like me to move on?" he asked, though the thought of leaving twisted something deep in his chest. "That's not what I want," she said quickly, then seemed surprised by her own vehemence. "But I need to know what this is, Emmett, what we are. The work arrangement was simple enough, but it's become something more, and I don't know what to call it." Through the window, he could see the familiar landscape of the ranch, the pastures, where cattle grazed peacefully, the corrals where horses dozed in the morning sun, the outbuildings that sheltered the tools and equipment of honest work. It had become home in a way nowhere had been home since the war ended, and the thought of losing it felt like facing another kind of death. "I don't have much to offer," he said carefully. "A man my age, with my past, isn't much of a catch for a woman like you. You could have your pick of suitorsmen with money, position, prospects for the future. Is that what you think this is about?" Josephine rose from her chair, her eyes flashing with something between anger and hurt. "Money and position. Do you think so little of me, or so little of yourself?" The question hung between them like a challenge. In the silence, Emmett could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the eaves. All the sounds of a life that had room for him if he was brave enough to claim it. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've been running from who I used to be for so long that I forgot I might be worthy of becoming someone new." Her expression softened, and she stepped closer. "Who were you, Emmett? Really?" The saber in his bedroll seemed to grow heavier with the weight of memory. "A soldier, an officer, toward the end." led men into battles that needed fighting, made decisions that kept some alive and got others killed. He met her eyes, letting her see the shadows there. When the war ended, I didn't know how to be anything else. Spent 15 years trying to figure out who Emmett Cole was when he wasn't wearing a uniform. And have you figured it out? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Starting to. He's a man who knows how to fix what's broken and protect what's worth keeping. A man who's found something worth staying for, if she'll have him. The space between them seemed to shrink without either moving. Josephine reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of an old scar he'd never told her about. The talk in town doesn't matter, she said softly. What matters is what we decide, here, between us. Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard broke the moment. Through the window, they watched a fancy buggy approach, drawn by matched horses and driven by a man in an expensive suit. The visitor climbed down with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to ranch life, brushing dust from his coat as if it personally offended him. "Jonathan Blackwood," Josephine said, her voice flat with resigned recognition. "My sister's idea of a suitable match." She moved away from Emmett, and the distance felt like a physical thing. He's a banker from Austin, wealthy, well-connected. Everything a practical woman should want. The knock at the door came precisely, neither too loud nor too soft, perfectly calculated for propriety. Emmett found himself studying the visitor through the window, noting the soft hands, the careful posture, the way the man's eyes assessed the ranch's value rather than appreciating its beauty. Here was everything Emmett wasn't: refined, prosperous, socially acceptable. "You should answer the door," Emmett said, though the words tasted bitter. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." As he walked away, he caught Josephine's reflection in the window glass, her face a mask of polite preparation for a conversation she didn't want to have. Behind him, the knock came again, and he heard her footsteps moving toward the door that would let in complications neither of them were ready to face. The telegraph message arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by young Billy Martinez, who rode for the Western Union office in town. Clara's precise handwriting covered the yellow paper in neat lines that somehow managed to convey disapproval even through dots and dashes transmitted across hundreds of miles. Arriving Saturday with Mr. Blackwood's stop arrangements, made for proper courtship stop time. To think of future, not past. Stop your loving sister, Clara. Josephine read the message twice before setting it aside with the kind of careful control that suggested volcanic forces held in check. Through the kitchen window, she could see Emmett working with the horses, his movements carrying the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. The contrast between his genuine capability and Jonathan Blackwood's polished artificiality couldn't have been sharper. "Trouble?" Maria asked, glancing at the telegram. "My sister thinks she knows what's best for me." Josephine's voice carried years of accumulated frustration with Clara's well-meaning interference. "She's bringing a suitor, someone she's decided would make a suitable husband." Maria's knowing look said everything her words didn't need to. At 62, she'd watched enough of life unfold to recognize the difference between what people needed and what they thought they wanted. "And what does your heart tell you about this suitable husband?" Before Josephine could answer, the sound of riders approaching made both women look toward the yard. A group of men on horseback approached the house, their faces grim and purposeful. Emmett emerged from the corral, his posture shifting subtly into something more alert, more dangerous. The lead rider was Sam Fletcher, foreman of the neighboring Rocking H spread. His hat was pulled low against the sun, but his weathered face was tight with worry. "Mrs. LaRue," he called as she stepped onto the porch. "We've got trouble brewing. Rustlers hit the Rocking H last night, took near 40 head, and left 2 of my men tied up in the barn." The implications settled over the group like a cold wind. If the rustlers were operating again despite Emmett's previous intervention, it meant they'd regrouped with more men and greater determination. "Same group as before?" Emmett asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. "Think so, but bigger now. Professional operation, well-armed, and organized. They left word that any ranch that can't protect its stock might as well sell out now before things get worse. Fletcher's eyes found Josephine's. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but they mentioned the Double J specifically, said a widow woman had no business trying to run cattle in a man's world." The insult stung, but not as much as the threat behind it. Someone was orchestrating these attacks, using them to pressure independent ranchers into selling. The timing couldn't be coincidental with Clara arriving Saturday, bringing her banker suitor. The message was clear: marry well and sell out, or face escalating trouble. "How many men can you spare for defense?" Emmett asked Fletcher, already thinking tactically. "3, maybe 4. The rocking H can't afford to leave the home place unguarded." Fletcher looked around the group of neighboring ranchers who'd ridden with him. "Between all of us, we might scrape together a dozen men, but these rustlers have twice that number, and they're not afraid to use their guns." Josephine watched Emmett as he processed the information, seeing him shift from ranch hand to something else entirely. The careful way he evaluated the terrain, counted escape routes, assessed defensive positions, these weren't skills learned from herding cattle. This was military thinking, the product of training and experience in situations where mistakes meant death. "We don't fight them head-on," Emmett said finally. "That's what they're expecting, and they're better equipped for that kind of confrontation. Instead, we make them come to us on ground of our choosing." "You sound like you've done this before," Fletcher observed. "Once or twice." Emmett's understatement carried the weight of memories he didn't share. "The key is making them think they have the advantage, while ensuring they don't. Set up your defenses to look weaker than they are, then hit them when they're committed to an attack they can't withdraw from." Old Pete had joined the group, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the grim focus of a man who'd fought in range wars before the law came to Texas. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Information first. We need to know their numbers, their weapons, their patterns of movement. Then we need to coordinate our defenses so they can't pick us off one ranch at a time." Emmett turned to Josephine. "This is going to get dangerous, ma'am. Maybe you should consider visiting your sister until this blows over." The suggestion sparked something fierce in Josephine's eyes. "This is my ranch, my home, my fight. I'm not running from men who think they can intimidate me into selling what Thomas died building." "Didn't think you would," Emmett said with a slight smile. "But I had to ask. Now, here's what we're going to do." The planning session stretched through the afternoon, with riders sent to coordinate with other ranchers and preparations made for what everyone understood might be a decisive confrontation. Emmett's organizational skills impressed even the most skeptical neighbors, and by sunset, they had the framework of a defense that might actually work. As the visiting ranchers prepared to return to their own spreads, Fletcher pulled Josephine aside. "Don't know where you found that man," he said quietly, "but he knows his business. Haven't seen tactical thinking like that since the war." After the others left, Josephine found herself alone with Emmett in the gathering dusk. The telegram from Clara lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its demands for proper courtship seeming absurdly insignificant compared to the real dangers they faced. "You were an officer," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Captain, 5 Texas Cavalry. Specialized in reconnaissance and harassment tactics behind enemy lines." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the pride beneath it, carefully controlled, but still present. "Led men who trusted me to bring them home alive, and mostly, I managed to do it." "What happened after the war?" Emmett was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Peace is harder than war for some men. In war, your enemies are clear, your objectives are defined, your value is measured by results. In peace, you have to figure out who you are when no one needs you to fight for them." She moved closer, drawn by something in his voice that spoke of loneliness deeper than her own. "Someone needs you to fight now." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the man he'd been before. Disappointment taught him to doubt his worth. "Yes," he said simply, "someone does." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring complications neither could fully predict. Saturday would arrive with Clara and her suitable banker, but tonight belonged to them, and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Saturday arrived with the punctuality of a church service and twice the judgment. Clara's carriage rolled up the drive in a cloud of dust and disapproval, its polished exterior reflecting the morning sun like a mirror designed to blind the unwary. Beside her sat Jonathan Blackwood, his posture perfect and his smile practiced, every inch the prosperous gentleman caller that Cedar Flat society would deem appropriate for a widow of means. Josephine watched from the porch, acutely aware of Emmett's absence from the yard. He'd made himself scarce since dawn, working the far pastures with a determination that suggested he understood the delicacy of the situation. The other hands had followed his lead, giving the main house a wide berth that allowed the family drama to unfold without audience. "Josephine, darling." Clara descended from the carriage with practiced grace, her traveling dress somehow unmarked by the dust that coated everything else in Texas. At 45, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that spoke of careful maintenance and unlimited resources, her husband's shipping fortune having purchased her a life of comfortable predictability in Charleston society. The embrace they shared carried all the complicated affection of sisters who loved each other but understood the world differently. Clara's perfume something expensive and floral seemed out of place against the honest sense of earth and cattle that defined the Double J. "And this is Mr. Jonathan Blackwood," Clara announced, stepping back to present her prize like a merchant displaying quality goods. "Jonathan, my dear sister Josephine, the one I've told you so much about." Blackwood's bow was precisely calculated, neither too deep nor too shallow, the gesture of a man accustomed to making favorable impressions. His gold pocket watch caught the light as he straightened, the chain glinting against a vest that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. "Mrs. LaRue, the pleasure is entirely mine. Your sister's descriptions hardly did justice to your beauty." The compliment was smooth as silk and just as substantial. Josephine accepted it with the grace of someone who'd learned to navigate social expectations, but she found herself comparing his practiced charm to Emmett's genuine reserve. Where Blackwood's attention felt calculated, Emmett's felt earned. "Welcome to the Double J," she replied, stepping back to gesture toward the house. "I trust the journey wasn't too arduous." "Nothing that couldn't be endured for the privilege of making your acquaintance." Blackwood's smile revealed teeth as perfect as his manners, white and straight and somehow predatory. "Though I confess, the accommodations between here and Austin leave much to be desired. Perhaps when we're better acquainted, we might discuss more civilized arrangements for future visits." The presumption in his words was subtle but unmistakable. He spoke as if their courtship was a foregone conclusion, as if her consent was merely a formality to be observed before proceeding to more practical matters. Clara's satisfied expression suggested this attitude was exactly what she'd hoped, for a man confident enough to sweep her stubborn sister into a sensible marriage. Over luncheon, prepared with Maria's usual excellence, the conversation followed predictable paths. Blackwood spoke of Austin's growing sophistication, the advantages of city life, the opportunities available to a woman with the foresight to align herself with progressive thinking. Clara nodded approvingly at each point, occasionally adding observations about Charleston's cultural superiority that made Josephine feel like a primitive relation in need of civilizing. "Of course, ranch life has its charms," Blackwood conceded magnanimously, cutting his beef with surgical precision. "But surely, a woman of your intelligence recognizes the limitations of such an isolated existence. What opportunities are there here for intellectual stimulation, cultural refinement, social advancement?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Through the dining room window, Josephine could see the familiar landscape that had shaped her life for over a decade, rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, the creek that provided water in dry seasons, the vast sky that painted itself different colors every day. It wasn't sophisticated by Austin's standards, but it was real in ways that Blackwood's polished world could never be. "I find plenty of stimulation in building something that lasts," she replied carefully. "Thomas and I created this ranch from nothing but vision and hard work. There's satisfaction in that kind of accomplishment that I'm not sure city life could provide." "Ah, but consider what you might accomplish with proper resources and support." Blackwood leaned forward, his enthusiasm seeming genuine for the first time. "A woman with your organizational skills and my financial backing could achieve remarkable things. I'm developing several properties in Austin that could benefit from your practical experience." Clara beamed at this turn in the conversation. "Isn't that wonderful, dear? Jonathan has such vision for the future, such grand plans. You could be part of something truly significant instead of—" She gestured vaguely toward the window, her meaning clear without words. The dismissal of everything Josephine had built stung more than any direct insult could have. This wasn't just her home or her livelihood. It was Thomas's legacy, the physical manifestation of dreams they'd shared and sacrifices they'd made together. To reduce it to something she should be eager to escape felt like a betrayal of everything that mattered. "I appreciate the offer," she said with careful politeness, "but the Double J isn't something I'm looking to abandon. It's home." "Sentiment is admirable in its place," Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting he found such attachment charmingly naive. "But sentiment doesn't pay debts or secure futures. Clara mentioned you faced some financial difficulties recently. Surely practical considerations must outweigh emotional attachments when circumstances demand it." The conversation had taken a turn that made Josephine's spine stiffen with defensive pride. Clara's well-meaning interference had apparently included detailed discussions of the ranch's finances, information that Blackwood was now wielding with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to getting his way through superior resources. "My circumstances are manageable," she replied, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. The banknote still loomed, and losing cattle to rustlers hadn't improved her position. But admitting weakness to this man felt like surrender before the battle had even begun. "Of course they are." Blackwood's agreement was patronizing, the verbal equivalent of patting her on the head. "With proper guidance, I'm sure we could develop strategies that would secure your future while allowing you to maintain some connection to your current interests." The afternoon stretched endlessly, filled with more of Blackwood's patient explanations of why her life needed improving and Clara's enthusiastic endorsement of his plans. By evening, Josephine felt exhausted by the effort of remaining polite, while every instinct screamed at her to defend what she'd built. It was only when Blackwood excused himself to smoke on the porch that she caught her first glimpse of Emmett since morning. He was working near the barn, his movements carrying the efficient purpose of a man comfortable with physical labor. Even at a distance, the contrast between his genuine competence and Blackwood's polished artificiality was striking. "He's quite handsome in a rough sort of way," Clara observed, following her sister's gaze. "Is he the one causing all the gossip in town?" The shoebox had been tucked away in the back of Thomas's wardrobe for 3 years, forgotten beneath winter coats that still carried his scent. Josephine discovered it while preparing the guest room for Clara's extended visit, her sister having announced plans to stay until this courtship business is properly settled. The faded cardboard gave way easily when she lifted the lid, revealing a treasure that made her heart catch in her throat. Love letters, dozens of them, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to the color of summer sky seen through morning mist. Thomas's careful handwriting covered page after page of cheap paper, words penned during their courtship, when he'd been nothing more than an ambitious young man with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his bank account. "My dearest Josephine," the first letter began, dated 3 months before their wedding. "I know your father thinks I'm not good enough for you, and maybe he's right. I can't offer you the fine house you deserve or the fancy dresses other men could buy. All I have is this piece of land that doesn't look like much now, and 2 hands willing to work until they bleed to make something of it. But I can promise you this, Every fence I build, every well I dig, every head of cattle I raise will be done with love for you. Maybe someday you'll be proud to call me your husband." The words, blurred as tears she hadn't expected, filled her eyes. She'd forgotten how uncertain Thomas had been at the beginning, how her family's disapproval had nearly broken his confidence. Her father had been a successful merchant who'd expected his daughter to marry within her social circle, not throw herself away on a penniless dreamer with dirt under his fingernails. She read on, following the progression of their courtship through Thomas's eyes. Each letter revealed more of his self-doubt, his determination to prove himself worthy, his growing amazement that she chose him despite having what he called better prospects. The man who'd written these letters was vulnerable in ways the confident rancher she'd married had rarely shown, and reading them now felt like discovering a secret room in a house she thought she knew completely. "Your sister Clara visited today," read a letter dated 6 months into their marriage. "She's still not convinced you made the right choice, and I can't say I blame her. Sometimes I look at you across the dinner table and wonder what stroke of fortune made you see something in me worth keeping. But then you smile that way you do when you think I'm not watching, and I remember that love doesn't follow the rules of logic or society. It just is, and we're blessed to have found it." The parallel to her current situation was unmistakable. Clara's disapproval, the pressure to choose security over sentiment, the doubt about following her heart rather than her head, was the same pattern repeating itself a generation later. The only difference was that this time Clara was advocating for the safe choice rather than questioning it. A soft knock interrupted her reading. "Ma'am?" Emmett's voice carried through the door, carefully respectful. "Old Pete sent me to tell you we've got company coming up the drive. Looks like trouble." She tucked the letters back into their box and hurried to the window. A group of riders approached the house, their posture aggressive and their weapons visible. Even at a distance, she could see they weren't local. Mentha gear was too good, their horses too fresh, their manner too professional for ordinary cowboys. "How many?" she asked, joining Emmett on the porch where he'd positioned himself with clear sightlines in all directions. "8, that I can see, probably more hanging back. They're well-armed and organized." His voice carried the calm assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. "Where are your guests?" "Clara's resting. Blackwood went to town on business." The timing struck her as oddly convenient. These men had arrived when the ranch's defenses were reduced and witnesses were few. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with the kind of mustache that suggested vanity and the kind of gun that suggested violence. His horse was a fine animal, well cared for and expensive, not the mount of a common rustler. When he spoke, his accent carried traces of education beneath the frontier drawl. "Mrs. LaRue," he called, touching his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy. "Name's Wade Morrison. I represent certain business interests that have taken notice of your situation here." "What kind of business interests?" Josephine kept her voice steady, though she was acutely aware of Emmett's stillness beside her. He'd positioned himself where he could reach his rifle quickly, and his eyes never stopped moving as he counted enemies and evaluated escape routes. The kind that solved problems for folks smart enough to recognize opportunity. Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "See, there's been talk that this spread might be available for purchase soon, market forces and all that. My employers are prepared to make a generous offer that would save everyone a lot of trouble. The Double J isn't for sale." "Now, ma'am, that's a shame to hear, because the alternative to a friendly sale might be unpleasant." His gesture encompassed his men, their weapons, the implicit threat they represented. "Accidents happen on remote ranches. Fires start, cattle wander off, people get hurt trying to protect what they can't hold on to anyway." Emmett stepped forward slightly, a movement so subtle it barely registered, but which Morrison's trained eye caught immediately. The two men studied each other with the recognition of predators, evaluating potential threats, each taking the measure of skills honed in different arenas, but equally dangerous. "Friend of yours, Mrs. LaRue?" Morrison asked, his tone carrying new interest. "Awful lot of confidence for a hired hand." "Confidence comes from being right," Emmett replied evenly. And you're wrong if you think 8 men are enough to take this place. The tension in the yard thickened like summer air before a thunderstorm. Morrison's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons as they read the signals their leader was sending. This had moved beyond simple intimidation into something more dangerous. 8 men here, Morrison corrected with a cold smile. But we've got friends scattered around the county, keeping an eye on all the neighboring spreads. Accidents could happen in a lot of places if cooperation isn't forthcoming. Before anyone could respond, the sound of an approaching carriage interrupted the standoff. Blackwood's rental rig came up the drive at a pace that suggested haste, dust billowing behind wheels that had been pushed harder than their usual dignified pace. The banker's face was pale as he pulled up beside the group of riders, his civilized world colliding with frontier reality in ways he was clearly unprepared for. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he took in the armed men, and the tension crackling between them. "Josephine, what's happening here?" Morrison's attention shifted to the newcomer with predatory interest. "And you are?" "Jonathan Blackwood, Mrs. LaRue's friend. I demand to know what business you have here." "Business that's about to be concluded, one way or another," Morrison replied, his smile turning ugly, "unless someone's prepared to be reasonable about market realities." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and Josephine realized they were balanced on the edge of violence that could change everything. In Thomas's letters, he'd written about moments like this times, when the future hinged on decisions made in heartbeats, when character revealed itself under pressure. Looking at the men arrayed before her house, she understood that her choice would define not just her own fate, but the kind of person she chose to be when everything she valued was threatened. The wanted poster was yellow with age, the ink faded, but still legible enough to destroy a man's life. Blackwood held it like a weapon, his manicured fingers trembling slightly as he faced the gathering in Josephine's parlor. The afternoon's confrontation with Morrison's men had ended without bloodshed, but the banker's triumphant expression suggested a different kind of violence was about to begin. "I hired a private investigator," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "After witnessing that unpleasantness in the yard, I thought it prudent to learn more about the man you've entrusted with your safety." Clara leaned forward from her position on the settee, her face already arranged in the expression of vindicated concern she'd worn throughout Josephine's courtship with Thomas. "What did you discover, Jonathan?" "That Emmett Cole is a wanted man." Blackwood placed the poster on the coffee table with theatrical precision, positioning it where everyone could see the crude drawing and bold text proclaiming a reward for desertion in the face of the enemy. A deserter who abandoned his men during the Battle of Cedar Creek, leaving them to die while he saved his own cowardly hide. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the evening pastures. Josephine stared at the poster, her mind racing to reconcile the image of cowardice it painted with the man who'd risked his life, tracking rustlers and faced down 8 armed men without flinching. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "Austin has access to federal records that rural counties lack," Blackwood replied, with the smugness of someone who'd used resources others couldn't access. "A simple telegraph to the right offices, a modest fee to the right investigator, and voila, truth about your noble protector." Emmett stood in the doorway where he'd been summoned to hear the accusations. His face was carved from stone, revealing nothing of the emotions that must have been churning beneath the surface. When he spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock. "The poster's real," he said simply. "The charge isn't." "Convenient," Clara sniffed. "I suppose you have an explanation for why the United States Army would falsely accuse one of its own officers." "I do." Emmett entered the room fully, his presence somehow making the elegant furniture seem fragile and ornamental. "But it's not a convenient one. And it's not pretty." Josephine watched his face as he prepared to defend himself against charges that had clearly haunted him for years. The careful reserve she'd learned to read as dignity revealed itself as the armor of a man who'd grown accustomed to being judged for something he hadn't done. Cedar Creek was a disaster from the beginning. Emmett began, his voice carrying the weight of memory. We were ordered to hold a position that couldn't be held, with men who were barely more than boys and supplies that had been promised but never arrived. When the Confederate artillery found our range, we lost half the company in the first 10 minutes. He moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful ranch landscape as if seeing a different scene entirely. My orders were to hold at all costs. But costs have a way of becoming real when you're watching 18-year-old boys die for ground that won't matter a week later. So you ran, Blackwood said, with the certainty of someone who'd never faced such choices. So I evacuated the wounded. Emmett's correction carried quiet force. 15 men who would have died if they'd stayed, including my sergeant who'd taken shrapnel in the chest and my lieutenant who'd lost his leg to a cannonball. I got them to a field hospital 2 miles behind the lines, then went back for more. Clara's expression had shifted from disapproval to uncertainty. Then why were you charged with desertion? Because Colonel Marcus Whitfield needed someone to blame for losing a position he'd ordered, held against military sense. The name came out like a curse, heavy with years of accumulated bitterness. He'd already lost 2 companies to poor planning and worse leadership. When I evacuated my men instead of letting them die for his mistake, he found his scapegoat. Josephine found her voice. What happened to the men you saved? Most of them survived the war. Some came to find me afterward, to thank me for making the choice their families couldn't. His smile was sad and proud at the same time. They knew the truth, but they weren't the ones writing the official reports. A touching story, Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but ultimately unprovable. The record stands, you're a deserter and a coward, hardly suitable company for a respectable woman. The record can be corrected, Emmett replied with quiet confidence. I've been gathering evidence for years, witness statements, medical records, correspondence from the men I saved. Enough to clear my name if I ever found a place worth clearing it for. The implication hung in the air between them. Josephine felt something shift in her understanding, not just of Emmett, but of the choices that had brought him to her door. He hadn't been running from his past so much as carrying it, waiting for the right moment to confront accusations that had shaped 15 years of wandering. Even if that's true, Clara interjected, her voice carrying the practical concern of someone focused on social realities. The damage to your reputation would be considerable. Association with a man under such a cloud, regardless of the ultimate truth, would be association with a man who chose saving lives over following orders that made no sense, Josephine interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. A man who spent 15 years carrying shame that wasn't his, because he valued other people's lives more than his own reputation. Blackwood's expression hardened at this turn in the conversation. Josephine, surely you can't be serious. The practical considerations alone are less important than the moral ones. She stood, moving to position herself beside Emmett, in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. I've seen this man's character tested under pressure. I've watched him risk his life for cattle and strangers and causes that weren't his own. If that's not proof enough of his worth, then no proof would be. You're making a mistake, Blackwood said, his facade of genteel suitor cracking to reveal something harder beneath. A mistake that will cost you everything you've built here. Without my financial backing, this ranch won't survive the next 6 months. The banknote alone will destroy you. And that's before Morrison's people escalate their campaign of intimidation. The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to getting his way through superior resources. Clara gasped at the implication, while Emmett's posture shifted subtly into something more dangerous. Are you saying you're connected to Morrison? Josephine asked, her voice deadly quiet. I'm saying that certain business interests have plans for this region that don't include stubborn widows clinging to properties they can't maintain. Blackwood's mask had slipped entirely now, revealing the calculating manipulator beneath the polished exterior. Marriage to me would have provided protection, but if you're determined to throw yourself away on a wanted criminal... He never finished the sentence. Emmett moved with fluid precision, covering the distance between them in 2 steps and lifting Blackwood from his chair, with one hand gripping his expensive jacket. The banker's feet dangled inches from the floor as he found himself face to face with the kind of controlled violence he'd only heard about in stories. "Choose your next words carefully," Emmett said in a voice like winter wind across frozen ground, "because they might be your last." The transformation was complete. The humble drifter had vanished, replaced by the cavalry officer who'd led men through battles and made decisions that kept them alive. This was the man the army had lost when politics triumphed over truth, and Blackwood's pale face suggested he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Put him down, Emmett," Josephine said quietly. "He's not worth the trouble killing him would cause." The tension held for another heartbeat before Emmett released his grip, letting Blackwood stumble back into his chair. The banker straightened his jacket with hands that shook slightly, his composure shattered beyond repair. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have no idea the forces you're opposing." "Maybe not," Josephine replied, "but I know the man I'm standing with, and that's enough." As Blackwood and Clara prepared to leave in a flurry of outraged respectability, Josephine felt the weight of the choice she'd made. She'd chosen love over security, truth over reputation, the difficult path over the easy one. Whether it would prove wise remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, she felt fully alive. The dawn air carried the scent of rain that might never come, and the threat of violence that certainly would. Emmett stood at the kitchen window with a cup of Maria's coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the horizon for signs of trouble that experience told him was coming. 3 days had passed since Blackwood's departure, 3 days of deceptive calm that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. Josephine emerged from Thomas's study with a leather portfolio clutched against her chest, her face bearing the expression of someone who'd discovered treasure in the ruins of despair. The folder contained documents she'd found hidden behind a loose board in her late husband's desk papers that could change everything if they reached the right hands in time. "Thomas was more careful than either of us knew," she said, setting the portfolio on the kitchen table with reverent precision. "He filed additional claims on the mineral rights to the eastern sections, claims that were approved but never recorded in the county office. If these documents are valid—" "They're valid," Emmett interrupted, having spent the morning reviewing the papers with the eye of someone who'd learned to evaluate legal documents during his military service. "The question is whether we can get them properly recorded before Morrison's people make their next move." The hidden mineral rights represented Salvation coal deposits and possible silver veins that would make the Double J worth 10 times its current value. Thomas had discovered them during his final year, filing claims through Austin offices that Blackwood's investigation had somehow missed. It was the kind of foresight that spoke to Thomas's deep understanding of the land he'd loved and his determination to provide for Josephine even after death. Old Pete burst through the kitchen door without knocking, his weathered face grim with urgency. "Riders coming," he announced. "More than we can handle with just the hands we've got. They're spread out along the creek, cutting off the road to town." Through the window, Emmett could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. Morrison had learned from their previous encounter, bringing enough men to overwhelm any defense the ranch could mount. But numbers weren't everything in a fight. Positioning, preparation, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary could overcome superior force if the defender was smart enough and desperate enough. "How long do we have?" Emmett asked, already moving toward the gun cabinet where Thomas's rifles waited in oiled readiness. 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if they're taking their time to get positioned." Pete accepted the rifle. Emmett handed him with the familiarity of someone who'd carried such weapons through harder conflicts. "Young Tom's got the horses ready in the barn, and Lewis is watching the south approach." Maria bustled in from the pantry with a canvas bag filled with supplies, ammunition, water, medical supplies, and food that could sustain them through a siege if necessary. Her movements carried the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for such moments before, during the troubles that had plagued the region in the years after the war. "The federal marshal in Austin," Josephine said suddenly, clutching the portfolio tighter. "If these documents reach him, along with Emmett's evidence about the desertion charges. "Won't matter if we're dead," Emmett replied, with the bluntness of someone focused on immediate survival. But his mind was working on multiple levels, evaluating not just the tactical situation, but the larger game Morrison's employers were playing. "Though you're right about the documents, someone needs to get them to Austin, and that someone can't be here when the shooting starts." The implication was clear, and Josephine's rejection was immediate. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "You're not leaving me, you're completing the mission." Emmett's tone carried the authority of his former rank, the voice of an officer making decisions that others had to trust, even when they couldn't see the full picture. "Those papers are the only thing that can end this permanently. Without them, we're just postponing the inevitable." Young Tom appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from running. "They've got the main road blocked, but the old cattle trail through Miller's Canyon is still clear. Horse could make it to Austin in 6 hours if it was pushed hard." The plan crystallized in Emmett's mind with military precision. Josephine would take the documents and Thomas's fastest horse, using the canyon trail to reach Austin, while the ranch held out against Morrison's assault. It was risky she'd be alone on dangerous ground, with no guarantee of reaching help in time. But it was the only chance they had to turn defense into victory. "I can't ask you to do this," Josephine said, though her voice carried the understanding that she was already committed to the attempt. "You're not asking, I'm ordering." Emmett's smile took the sting out of his words. "Someone has to live to tell the story of what happened here, and it needs to be someone the federal marshal will believe." The sound of approaching riders grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the creak of leather that spoke of men prepared for serious work. Through the window, they could see Morrison's force taking positions around the ranch, building's professional deployment that confirmed these weren't ordinary rustlers, but something far more dangerous. Emmett moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking locks, positioning weapons, ensuring that every angle was covered. The main house was solidly built, with thick walls and few windows, but it wasn't a fortress. Holding it would require cunning more than firepower, and luck more than either. "There's something else you need to know," he said as Josephine prepared to leave. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a leather case that had traveled with him for 15 years, evidence he'd gathered to clear his name. Witness statements and official correspondence that told the true story of Cedar Creek. "Captain Samuel Morrison, 3rd Ohio Artillery," he said, producing a photograph that made Josephine's breath catch. The man in the faded image was younger, wearing a Union uniform, but the face was unmistakably the same one that had threatened her 3 days ago. "Wade Morrison's brother, killed at Cedar Creek when his battery was overrun. Wade blamed me for not reinforcing the position, never understood that reinforcing it would have meant more dead men and no change in the outcome." The revelation added a personal dimension to the conflict that explained Morrison's particular animosity. This wasn't just business, it was revenge, the settling of old scores that had festered for 15 years. Understanding that changed the tactical situation significantly, because personal vendettas made men take risks that pure profit wouldn't justify. "He's here for you specifically," Josephine realized. "He's here to finish what he started when he got me branded a deserter. The financial pressure on your ranch, the rustling, the intimidation, it was all designed to flush me out if I ever surfaced." Emmett's voice carried the weight of someone who'd finally understood the full scope of the trap that had been closing around him for years. "Blackwood's investigation didn't find me by accident. They've been watching, waiting for me to care about something enough to make a stand." The knowledge that she'd been used as bait in a game she didn't understand should have angered Josephine, but instead she felt a strange sense of completion. All the threads were coming together: Thomas's hidden legacy, Emmett's buried past, her own choice to fight rather than surrender. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just who lived or died, but what kind of people they proved themselves to be when everything was at stake. "The federal marshal will need both sets of documents," she said, understanding now why Emmett's evidence was as important as Thomas's mineral claims. "Your vindication and our financial salvation are tied together." "They always were," he replied. "From the moment I knocked on your door asking for work, I just didn't understand it then." The sound of horses stopping in the yard announced the end of preparation time. Morrison's voice carried across the distance, offering terms that both sides knew were lies-safe passage in exchange for surrender, mercy for cooperation. All the false promises that preceded violence when negotiation was never the real intention. Emmett handed Josephine the portfolio containing both sets of documents, the weight of paper that could reshape 2 lives if it reached the right hands. "Thomas's legacy and my redemption," he said. "Don't let either of them die here today." She kissed him then, hard and desperate, and full of everything they hadn't had time to say. It lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of promises made and futures that might never come to pass. "Come back to me," she whispered against his lips. "Count on it," he replied, though they both knew that some promises were made to be hoped for rather than kept. As Josephine slipped out the back door toward the barn where Tom waited with the horses, Emmett took his position at the front window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, where Morrison's men waited for orders, their weapons ready and their intentions clear. This was the moment 15 years of running had been leading to the place where Emmett Cole would finally stand and fight for something worth defending. The war had ended at Appomattox, but for some men it never really ended at all. Today, on a Texas ranch built by love and threatened by greed, the final battle of Captain Emmett Cole's long campaign was about to begin. The federal marshals arrived like thunder after lightning, their badges catching the late afternoon sun as they rode hard toward the Double J, with papers that would change everything. Marshal James Crawford had received Josephine's desperate message just as his office was closing for the day, but the mineral rights documents and evidence of military injustice had galvanized him into immediate action. Behind him rode 6 deputies, enough firepower to tip the balance of any conflict they might encounter. Morrison's men were caught in the worst possible position, committed to an attack they couldn't abandon, facing defenders they couldn't overwhelm, with federal law enforcement arriving to witness whatever crimes they were about to commit. The professional composure that had marked their earlier intimidation attempts crumbled as they realized their carefully planned operation was falling apart. From his position at the main house window, Emmett watched the marshals deploy with military precision. Crawford's experience showed in the way he positioned his men to cut off escape routes while maintaining clear fields of fire. This was no longer a private dispute between ranchers and rustlers. It had become a federal matter involving wanted fugitives and documented crimes. "Morrison!" Crawford's voice carried across the yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Wade Morrison, you and your men are under arrest for cattle theft, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud property owners of legally held mineral rights." The silence that followed was broken only by the nervous whickering of horses and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. Morrison sat his mount in the center of his scattered force, his face a mask of calculation as he weighed impossible options. Surrender meant prison, but resistance meant death, and the federal marshals had made it clear they were prepared for either outcome. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," Morrison called back, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These people are harboring a known deserter, a wanted criminal." "Captain Emmett Cole's record has been reviewed and corrected," Crawford replied, producing a document from his saddlebags. "Presidential pardon signed this morning, based on new evidence and witness testimony. He's no longer wanted for anything except his outstanding service to his country." The words hit Emmett like a physical blow. 15 years of shame and exile dissolving in a single sentence. The boy who'd become a man in uniform, the officer who'd chosen saving lives over following orders, the veteran who'd carried undeserved disgrace through decades of wandering, all of it was finally acknowledged, corrected, redeemed. From the kitchen, he could hear Maria's voice raised in prayer, thanking saints and saviors for justice finally delivered. Old Pete's whoop of joy carried across the yard, while young Tom's excited chatter provided a soundtrack of celebration that seemed premature given the armed men still surrounding the ranch. But Morrison wasn't finished. The revelation about Emmett's vindication had shattered his justification for the vendetta, but 15 years of hatred didn't disappear because of federal paperwork. His hand moved toward his weapon with the deliberate motion of a man who'd decided that if he couldn't have justice, he'd settle for revenge. "Brother." The voice came from one of Morrison's own men, a younger rider whose family resemblance was unmistakable. "It's over, Wade. Let it go." "Samuel died because of him." Morrison's voice cracked with grief that had festered too long without resolution. "Our brother died because this coward wouldn't hold his position." "Samuel died because war kills good men," the younger Morrison replied, his own voice heavy with sorrow. "You've spent 15 years trying to make someone pay for something that was nobody's fault but the war's. It's time to stop." The family drama played out in full view of marshals and defenders, a moment of private pain made public by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Emmett felt the weight of another man's grief, understanding now the personal dimension that had driven Morrison's campaign against him. "I saved 15 men that day," Emmett called across the yard, his voice carrying without hostility. 15 sons who went home to their families instead of dying for ground that didn't matter. Your brother's battery was overrun because they were positioned in an indefensible location by officers who cared more about maps than lives. I'm sorry he died, but I won't apologize for keeping other men from joining him." The truth hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned and impossible to argue with. Morrison's younger brother nodded slowly, accepting what Wade had refused to acknowledge for 15 years. Around them, Morrison's hired men began to lower their weapons as the futility of their position became clear. "Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully," Crawford ordered, his voice carrying the finality of law backed by force. "This is your last chance to do this the easy way." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and redemption equally possible outcomes. In the golden light of the Texas afternoon, surrounded by the familiar sounds and scents of the ranch that had become home, Emmett waited to see whether his long journey toward redemption would end in justice or bloodshed. Wade Morrison's surrender came not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet collapse of a man who'd finally reached the end of his capacity for hatred. His gun dropped from nerveless fingers to thud against the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard, followed by the weapons of his men as they recognized the futility of resistance. 15 years of vendetta ended with a whisper rather than a bang, justice arriving in the form of federal badges and presidential pardons rather than gunfire and graves. Marshal Crawford moved with practiced efficiency, securing prisoners and evidence while his deputies rounded up the scattered members of Morrison's gang. The operation that had terrorized ranchers across 3 counties was over, its leaders bound for federal prison, and its hired guns scattering to whatever fate awaited men who'd chosen the wrong side of the law. Emmett emerged from the house on unsteady legs, the weight of vindication making him feel lighter and heavier at the same time. The presidential pardon Crawford had read aloud was real. He'd seen the official seal, heard the formal language that restored his honor and acknowledged his service. Captain Emmett Cole was no longer a wanted man, no longer a deserter, no longer carrying shame that had never rightfully belonged to him. 15 years, old Pete said, clapping him on the shoulder with the familiarity of someone who'd fought beside good men and recognized them regardless of their circumstances. 15 years of carrying that load, and now it's done. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Josephine's return, her horse lathered from the hard ride to Austin and back. She'd pushed the animal to its limits, getting the documents to the marshal's office, then pushed it again, getting home in time to witness the resolution of conflicts that had shaped both their lives. Her face was flushed with exhaustion and triumph as she dismounted in the yard where justice had finally arrived. "Is it over?" she asked, though the sight of Morrison and his men in federal custody already provided the answer. "It's over," Emmett confirmed, accepting the embrace she offered without reservation. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to believe in futures that extended beyond the next sunrise, in possibilities that included stability and love, and the kind of peace that came from having nothing left to run from. Marshal Crawford approached, with the air of a man completing necessary business. "Mrs. LaRue, the mineral rights documentation you provided has been validated and recorded. The Double J's ownership of those deposits is now a matter of federal record, which should resolve any financial difficulties you've been facing. The coal and silver beneath Thomas's carefully chosen land would ensure the ranch's prosperity for generations to come. More than that, it would fund the kind of improvements and expansions that Thomas had dreamed about during the long evenings when he'd planned for a future he wouldn't live to see." "And Captain Cole," Crawford continued, producing a leather folder from his saddlebags. "Your military records have been corrected, your rank restored, and your service commendation approved by the War Department. You're entitled to back pay for the years you spent under false charges, as well as the pension benefits that were wrongfully denied." The military commendation was a bronze medal that caught the afternoon light like captured fire, its weight substantial enough to anchor years of doubt and self-recrimination. Emmett held it carefully, reading the inscription that acknowledged his courage under fire and his leadership in saving wounded comrades. It was vindication made tangible, proof that doing the right thing sometimes took years to be recognized as such. Young Tom whistled appreciatively at the sight of the medal. "Captain Cole," he said, testing the title, "got a nice sound to it." "Just Emmett will do fine," Emmett replied, though he couldn't hide the satisfaction that came with having his honor officially restored. "The rank belongs to a younger man who served his country. I'm just a rancher now." "A rancher who owns part of one of the most valuable spreads in Texas," Josephine corrected, taking his hand with the confidence of a woman who'd made her choice and intended to live with its consequences. "That is, if he's interested in making the arrangement permanent." The proposal was delivered with characteristic directness, no flowery speeches or elaborate preparations, just an honest question from one partner to another about their shared future. Around them, the familiar sounds of the ranch continued, cattle lowing in distant pastures, wind singing through the eaves of the barn, the creek murmuring its way toward the river that would carry their story to places they'd never see. Emmett's answer came not in words, but in the kiss they shared, while federal marshals finished their paperwork and the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was the kiss of people who'd found their way home after long journeys through landscapes that had tested their strength and proven their worth. The simple gold wedding bands he'd purchased with his first honest wages in 15 years waited in his saddlebags, symbols of the partnership they'd already built through shared work and mutual respect. Tomorrow would bring the formal ceremonies that society required, but the real marriage had already taken place in moments of trust offered and accepted, in choices made when the stakes were highest, in the recognition that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. As the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, Emmett Cole was finally home. 1 year later, the Double J Ranch had become something Thomas LaRue could never have imagined, and everything he'd hoped for. The mineral wealth hidden beneath familiar pastures had transformed financial struggle into abundance. But more importantly, it had attracted the kind of people who understood that true prosperity was built on more than money. The ranch now employed 20 hands, supported 3 neighboring families, and served as a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that second chances were still possible in a world that often seemed to have given up on redemption. Emmett stood on the porch of the main house, watching the morning sun paint the eastern hills in shades of gold that reminded him why Texas sunrises were worth getting up early to see. In his arms, wrapped in a blanket that Maria had sewn with enough love to last a lifetime, his son slept with the peaceful certainty of a child who'd never known want or fear. Thomas Emmett Cole had arrived 3 months ago, carrying the legacy of 2 good men in his name and the promise of futures that extended beyond anything his parents had dared to dream. The baby stirred, making the small sounds that meant feeding time was approaching, and Emmett carried him inside to where Josephine waited with the kind of smile that made 15 years of wandering worthwhile. Motherhood had added new dimensions to her strength, revealing reserves of tenderness and fierce protectiveness that complemented the business acumen and practical wisdom that had saved the ranch in its darkest hour. "He's got your eyes," she said, settling into the rocking chair Thomas had built during their first year of marriage. "And your stubborn streak, judging by how he fights sleep." "Gets that from both sides of the family," Emmett replied, watching as she began the intimate ritual of feeding their child. There was something profound about witnessing the continuation of life, about understanding that love could create futures that transcended the mistakes and tragedies of the past. The formal photograph session was scheduled for later that morning, a professional portrait that would document the Cole family at this moment of completion and new beginning. Emmett had resisted the idea initially, uncomfortable with the kind of display that seemed to invite fate's attention, but Josephine had convinced him that some moments deserved to be preserved for the generations that would follow. Through the kitchen window, he could see the familiar rhythm of ranch life continuing as it had for over a decade. Old Pete was training two new hands in the proper care of breeding stock, his weathered voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned through experience what textbooks could never teach. Young Tom, no longer quite so young, supervised the loading of cattle bound for markets in Kansas City, where the Double J brand now commanded premium prices. The expansion had been careful and deliberate, guided by principles Thomas had established, and Emmett had refined through military discipline and hard-earned understanding of what it meant to build something lasting. They'd bought adjoining properties as they became available, always with an eye toward treating the land and its people with the respect both deserved. The result was an operation that prospered without exploiting, that grew without compromising the values that had made success possible in the first place. Clara had written to announce her intention to visit for the baby's christening, her letter carrying none of the disapproval that had marked her previous correspondence. The birth of a nephew had apparently softened her resistance to Josephine's choice of husband, and her most recent letters spoke of Emmett with something approaching pride. Even the most stubborn hearts could be changed by evidence of happiness genuinely achieved. The christening itself would take place in the same church where Josephine and Thomas had been married, with the same minister who'd presided over Thomas's funeral and witnessed the community's gradual acceptance of the weathered cowboy who'd proven his worth through actions rather than words. Reverend Matthews had been among the first to congratulate Emmett on his military vindication, understanding better than most how long the road to redemption could be. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked, her voice carrying the comfortable intimacy of people who no longer needed to guard their thoughts from each other, giving up the wandering life for all this domesticity. Emmett considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked about his feelings. The habit of solitude died hard, but he'd learned to trust her with thoughts and fears he'd never shared with another living soul. "I regret the 15 years I spent thinking I wasn't worthy of it," he said finally. "But I don't regret anything that led me to your door that morning." Outside, Luis was working with a young horse that showed promise of joining the string of cutting horses the Double J was becoming famous for throughout the region. The animal's initial resistance was giving way to trust as Luis demonstrated the patience and gentle persistence that marked all the best horsemen. It was a process Emmett understood, intimately the slow building of confidence between creatures that had been hurt by life, but were willing to try again when they found someone worthy of their trust. The day stretched ahead with its familiar rhythms of work and satisfaction, challenges met and problems solved through cooperation and determination. Tonight, there would be the comfortable exhaustion that came from useful labor, the satisfaction of looking across land that was thriving under careful stewardship, and the peace that came from knowing that his son would grow up understanding the difference between having things and building them. As the professional photographer arrived to document this moment of happiness achieved through perseverance, Emmett reflected on the strange paths that led people to their true homes. Sometimes a man's worth really wasn't visible on the surface, hidden beneath years of disappointment and circumstances beyond his control. But with enough time and the right person to see past appearances, Even the most weathered souls could find their way back to the light. The portrait they would create today would show three people who'd learned that love wasn't just about finding someone to share your life with, it was about becoming someone worthy of being found. In years to come, when Thomas Emmett Cole was old enough to understand, the photograph would tell him the story of parents who'd proven that second chances were always possible for those brave enough to believe in them. Sometimes, that was the most valuable inheritance any child could receive.